I am unashamed. What about you?
So I was planning on being in studio today, and but I basically came back down here to my southern lair because Lisa was taking her real estate test yesterday. She's been studying for about 3 months. And when you get in your 50s and you basically go back to school, which is what she's been doing, but she's been doing it online. You just don't know that you got it anymore, because we can't even hardly remember what we had for breakfast yesterday. So she's been like really into it. And so I've been trying to be like super supportive. And so basically I came back instead of staying to do the podcast and do it down here because she needed an emotional support animal, which is, you see a lot of guys, military, PTSD, they need emotional support animal to help them function. Well, basically that's what I am. I am Lisa's emotional support animal. So I came down here. She passed the test. She had to make at least a 70. Most people fail it the first time, we found out. And if they do pass it, they just barely pass. A lot of math involved. I was shocked. I thought real estate, you just show a house.
Al may be getting into the yuppie. I mean, that sounds like a definition of some kind of yuppie behavior. You go from the king of the castle to the emotional, what'd you call it, spirit animal?
He has
emotional support animal.
He has one verse that pretty well speaks highly of the particular movie now his role being an emotional support animal is that in Romans 12, a man should not think more highly of himself than he ought.
Yeah.
He's fulfilling that text. I'm just a dog.
But Al, you're being godly incorrect because we're actually humans. So
yeah.
Well, we are. And I still have my human role, but I just understood that she needed that to help her get through the process. So I was really proud of her. She did awesome. She studied hard. She made a 79 on it, I think. And so she passed with flying colors. So now she can sell houses and make some money. And
what was the best you could score out of 100?
Well, 100.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. But I'm telling you, most people that take it the first time, they fail it.
Strong C+ mind. That's good.
Well, it's like my driver test taker, whatever that person is. I went and took my driving test the first time, which I failed. And I failed the written.
You failed it?
I failed it. I'm not a good student, Phil. And so the streets were safe, for a while. So then I go back and I pass it, barely. And then I fail the driving part because I sped twice.
They got me because they said when you're coming off of going on to the interstate, where you're coming, they said, should you go as fast as they are on the interstate when you're on the ramp?
I missed it too.
Well, they said, or do you just blend in to the traffic and speed on in there?
Well, then there was a couple other choices.
No, you're careful there, but you don't want to get up to 70 miles an hour.
Yeah, right.
Coming off that sharp curve going out there.
Wrong.
I said, no, I'm not doing 70. They said, oh, wrong, or you're wrong. I said, no. I said, I don't care what that test, whoever made that test, I'm not hitting that thing at 70 miles an hour.
You've hit a nerve here. You've hit a nerve because my wife, she screams at me every time we get on interstate because that's the only place on the highways in the world. In that moment, you can go full NASCAR.
Yeah.
And so I just floor it every time. Everybody gets shifted because I just hit it. And I'm like, I'm following the law. I'm a law-abiding citizen.
Right.
And
I'm thinking, what if they're bumper to bumper when I get on the interstate? Right before, if they're bumper to bumper, there's not a spot if I'm come tearing out of there at 70 miles an hour. I said, I'm playing a little caution. They said, wrong. You missed that one.
I missed that too, but they'll move. And so the second time, all right, so then the third time, I had to take I said, I got to take the written too. I've already passed it. They're like, nope, you got to take it again. So I took it again and passed the driving. But I noticed that I only passed, it was like the minimum amount. If I'd have missed one more question, I'd have failed. And she said, I don't feel real safe because you barely passed. And we had a little conversation. Of course, I was 16 years old. I was like, but I did. She said, yeah, I know, but you barely did. So it wasn't a ringing endorsement. She was like, you're not a real safe driver because you missed the maximum amount that you could miss to pass. It's like, well, you need to try to change the test. I mean, if I passed. So I'll figure it out. I'll be all right.
Let's face it, at 15 and 16, it was 15 for me. How much can you really know? I mean, the book teaches you so much, and then you drive around, downtown West Monroe with this guy, that's not really real, because you're right. You want to do some real testing. You get out there and get on I-20 at the I-20 bridge. Now, that's some NASCAR,
Well,
that's the real deal. But you have to learn that by experience.
I had to do the test. The average mile per hour speed limit was 20 or 25. Well, and when I said I was speeding, you're like, because like my daughter the other day said, Dad, you sped. We were talking about this. I was like, I went 1 mile per hour over. I was like, in your driving test, 26 and a 25, boom, hammers coming down. There is no grace. Zero.
It's hard for a redneck to be legal when it comes to driving.
I've never thought about that, Phil.
That's right.
I don't really know what that means, but
we're not smart enough to be driving. That's what they're saying.
Do you agree with that?
And
I don't drive much, so they pretty well whoop me.
Boy, I thought it was self-deprecating humor, but I just think it's just self-deprecating.
It's hard.
Minus the humor.
It's hard to be a redneck and survive in this culture. Hard to be
you ought to go to one of these big cities. When I go through Austin,
tell me about it.
Completely different story.
Yep.
I'm acting like I'm getting on the interstate the whole time.
I every time I haven't been in a city a long time driving, but every time I'm there, I'm thinking these people are going too fast.
Yeah, they are. I agree with that.
It just seems like it's too fast.
But they do. Jace was right. They do get out of the way.
They get out of the way.
They all know
that's
that.
The only thing I'm
cautious
sure
person.
I love it. I love getting on the interstate. And I helped my daughter when she was taking her test. I said, look, this is the only thing in life that the law is just to go crazy. I said, you punch it and you come out and they don't get out of the way. Guess what? You'll never know about it. That's why we have the resurrection. Way more important to be focused on that.
I'm not quite sure about that logic, Jase, but I mean,
you should see me do it. When I get on it, I'm coming.
I just hope I'm not in the back seat with you driving.
Oh, I'm telling you, I'm coming wide open.
I know it.
Everything I got. And I have the test.
You don't rattle out with Jace, do you? So, no. Jace, you told me before we got on that Missy has been listening to the podcast, which I always thought was funny because Missy was on the podcast and you were squirming, which I found very entertaining. Well, so what's she saying about her podcast?
Here's the problem.
Is she a thumbs up?
Here's the problem. Let me tell you what the problem is, and I'm sure she'll listen to this, and we'll have to talk later. But what I keep telling her is, look, the Bible is true. It's a true story.
Yep.
We all agree on that. But we're commentating on the Bible. So what we're saying is based on a true story. So when I intervene, there is a possibility because, look, it's not just driving that offers challenges. I don't have the capacity to remember the exact details after about an hour. So if you start going back in time, you go back 6 months. So when I'm telling stories, as we're talking about the true story, there is a high probability that I may get one little detail wrong. It's the only thing I really agree with Si about other than Jesus is that, now Si says 95 and 5, but his is more, I don't agree with his percentage, but it's based on a true story, but some of Si's stories, I'm not sure they're really based on it at one time because, he's got the metaphysical acts and laws of gravity being defied in the story. I'm like, well, this is no longer based on a true story.
That's right.
Once you're doing things that are miraculous. So I said
remember, Jay, Si blows a lot of smoke.
Yeah. So I said all that to say that we have that because she doesn't feel comfortable about telling a story unless she knows all the facts or she declares that she doesn't remember the exact detail. So it makes me nervous when she listens to it because I'm like, there's probably a high probability, as many shows as we do, that I got some story wrong, but it was based on a true story. So it makes me nervous. But
if it spiced the story up, then all the better. That's kind of the Robertson way.
Well,
right?
she thinks that I'm only doing it, getting the facts wrong to spice the story up. But I'm like, no, I'm actually trying to, tell the truth. So it makes me nervous.
You'll know.
But she likes the podcast, which is, I'm shocked every time, because she said, I listened to it all the way over here. And I was like, oh boy, I just sit down. And she's like, it was good.
Yeah. Well,
okay, all right.
We all stumble in many ways, Jase, according to James. If anyone is never at fault in what he says, he's a perfect man, able to keep his whole body in check. So I just thought I'd throw that in for whatever you're thinking there. We all stumble in many ways.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, we do. And we need grace, which, look, we're doing these stories in narrative form that we read and are inspiring, and we're in Acts 14 and 15. But, if I just read this story, because a lot of people out here who don't believe, if they happen to listen to our podcast for the first time and you read a story that, Paul comes up there preaching, they're like, we're fixed to kill you. They stone him, which back in those days, that was something they were pretty sure, okay, he's dead, or
yep,
in no condition to be getting up and walking around.
He's not moving.
They drag him out of the city. They're like, okay, that's all that. Then, he's back. How long did he recover? 10 seconds.
Well, it says, so Jase, it was in actually 14:19. It says they stoned Paul, dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. So,
yeah,
not only did they stone him, they dragged him out with what they're thinking is a dead body. Maybe it was. And it says in verse 20 here, I love this one. It just says this like this. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. Next day he went and found Barnabas.
So we're
and left for
interjecting. If you put two and two together, that story, I would say something happened at the gathering. Something happened.
Now, some people would say, oh, no, he wasn't really dead. It's kind of the same thing with Jesus. He was just passed out, and then, he came to. But every time we read something like this, because you were right, Jase, these guys know how to kill people. Remember Stephen, who Paul, ironically, was overseeing his death? He didn't come back. He went on to heaven,
Mm-hmm. Well, it's because you had God directly working through these guys in a miraculous way to confirm their message. That's Hebrews 2. Miracles, signs, and wonders. And you get the full explanation on why they were occurring to confirm the message.
Yep.
They're like, Jesus is Lord. They're like, no, he's not. We're going to kill you. They kill him. And then they look up and he's back. Said, I told you that Jesus is Lord. And you're like, well, maybe he is. That's it.
That's it.
That's all you need to know. Right. That would do it for me. I'm in. You're just like, well, does he still do it today? We have the stories. I'm not going to say he's not, because he can do whatever he wants to.
That's right.
But I have this same story. You're still going to have to put some faith and trust in this. And faith is being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not see. But I think when Paul wrote in Romans that anybody should be able to look around and base on what they see as far as the creation and deduct there is a God.
I look at the earth's going around the sun 67,000 whatever miles an hour, takes 365 days to get around the sun one trip. Then you're back where you started. It's turning at, every 24 hours, it makes a complete turn. Half of it's dark, half of it's daylight. It works with such precision. When I read about somebody that death couldn't hold, I'm saying the one who put this cosmos into existence and the precision at how it works, there's nothing. Nothing can stop him. Nothing.
Well, I think what should have cued him
Hang on, Jase. Let's take a break. So one of our oldest and longest sponsors of Unashamed is a company called Keeps. And we talked quite a bit about them because basically they're trying to get people to keep their hair, which I thought about it. Poor Dad, if we could have just gotten him to keeps, a few years ago, he might not be quite as bald as he is today. He could have kept some of that hair, you think?
Yeah, he looks like one of these rock and roll drummers, but all he needs shades.
I wasn't aware.
Lose it early, shave off the rest of it.
I wasn't aware that fit into the drummer category, which is kind of funny.
Yeah.
But anyway, so this company basically helps you keep your hair. You go online. You got some questions. They send you send them a few pictures of your hair, and then they're going to put you in touch with a doctor, make sure everything's good for you. So if you want to try these guys out, hold on to some hair. It's Keeps, KEEPS.com/door. You get 50% off your first order. That's Keeps.com/door, 50% off your first order, and hang on to your hair.
What should have cued him in is when he just got through talking about in the previous chapter that the difference in Jesus' death and everyone else, animals included, his body didn't see decay. I mean, here's the thing. I thought about that like from a hunting situation,
Yep.
Or you're out in the woods and you go up and you run up on a decaying body and you say, yep, it's dead. If you die and your body doesn't decay, this is the person who you need to get hooked up with.
Because he's got controls of the atomic structure, the molecular structure of matter.
Yeah.
The one who's got control of that, and we know they're there. We've never seen an atom, but we know they're there. Your proton, neutron, your power. You're like, whoever dreamed that up and's got control of that, the Bible says God did, go with him.
But when
it comes to physical death, being stoned, hung, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it is crazy because somebody will listen to side stories and they're like, I think people think the same thing about the Bible. I mean, a fish swallowing, I've had that argument thrown to me in Bible studies more than any other. I mean, you actually think there's fish out there eating people and then you live to tell about it? It's like, well, I picked that one. How about the body not decaying? Let's go down that.
But to Dad's point, it's you mentioned this on the last podcast, Jase, from Acts 17, that God sets the time and places. And so obviously he wasn't ready for Paul yet because he had more things for Paul to do. So they either killed him and he brought him back, or they didn't quite kill him and he came back. But either way, it wasn't his time yet. Whereas in Stephen's case, it was his time. I mean, for the church to go forward, for everything to happen, God said, you know what, I'm just going to welcome you home. And I think there's a lot of encouragement for our audience out there because, somebody get cancer, somebody gets sick, somebody's parent, something happens with their child, and they're just like, I just don't understand why this is happening. But you got to understand, God holds it as a believer. God holds everything in his time, in his place. And if it's your time to go home, you go home. If it's your time to do more, you do more. I think ultimately you have to trust that much. Because Paul, he gets up off the ground and goes right back into work.
Humans tend to view physical death, and I guess because they don't see the individual anymore, but we tend to view physical death as the end. And so we use terms like they passed away, we lost they've died. But Peter, he said he viewed physical death as a departure. I feel a lot better about what Peter and the Apostle Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5:5 there.
Yeah.
When he talks about, we live in this tent of the body, and then we got a eternal house coming, and you start reading those texts, you say, good night. That's why Jesus said, you live and believe in me, you'll never die.
Yeah.
You'll never die. You'll depart. But departing sounds a lot better to me, Al, than a demise, meaning you are gone. Yeah. We lost you. No.
You're moving to the home office.
Didn't Paul say in Philippians, was it Philippians, where he said, look, it would be better for me personally. I would rather go on and be with the Lord. I mean, I'm ready to go. I feel like I've done what I can do here. I mean, I'd rather be with Jesus now. But he said, but for your sake, I'm going to stay on and do what God's calling me to do. And of course, he's getting beat up and flogged and stoned in every town he's in. I mean, I can imagine. I'd be like, you know what? I'm ready to go. But he said, I'm going to stay because it's better for the church if I'm still here. And what he was saying was, I trust in God to set my time and place.
Yeah.
Well,
why should any of you, the Apostle Paul to a big dog or Agrippa, why should any of you, we mentioned this last week, consider it incredible that God raises the dead? I mean, if he built the cosmos, and he's the author of life, why would you get all bent out of shape by just believing there's life beyond the grave, So that's where I am. I'm looking at it. I'm like, you know what? They dreamed this story up and they keep repeating it over and over and over and over, the resurrection of the dead.
I mean, to me, it's more ludicrous for, when you share this, people are like, well, these are the craziest stories coming back from the dead. But when you see humans in real life, to me, it's way more outlandishly stupid for some of the principles they apply, like a warranty for something. They're selling you a product, you pay the money, whatever it is, you buy a TV, $1,000. They're like, no, it's not over, because we'll give you an extended warranty. You're like, well, how much does that cost? And it ain't cheap. So they're trying to guarantee that the lifespan of this product, and you're like, well, if it's going to tear up, I don't want it. These are the conversations I have, because I have, all you're trying to do is get me money on an incredible lie, because they're like, well, what about a lifetime warranty? And it's like $50,000. I'm like, okay, so I give you this money and then I die. But I still can get this TV. And meanwhile, 2 years later, you came up with another one that's better. But, I have a lifetime warranty. I could buy 30 TVs. I mean, y'all, you see what I mean? I'm looking at them like, this is the dumbest thing, because you're trying to use decay as a way to monetize your bank account. And so I'm paying you for this assurance when, let's just be honest, this is a piece of junk and it's going to tear up. And you're trying to get way more money with some kind of guarantee that's incredible. It's not going to work, I've had them say, look, this thing has a surge protector, because we recently bought some TVs. This thing has a surge protector where if your apartment, which I took offense to that, I have a house, but I don't look like I do, blows up, it will be fine. And I'm like, okay, let me get this right. If my house blows up, do you think I'm worried about this TV? But I'm saying they will tell incredible stories to get more money for a guarantee that this won't tear up. Yeah. When we all know the lifespan of them is about 6 months.
I view the whole thing, TVs and all. I view the whole thing as bowing to Jesus after I read about what he had to say and what he did, what he's now doing, what he will do. I've checked him out. I'm literally, my insurance depends on Jesus, him crucified and raised from the dead. I consider that the greatest insurance policy of all time. And the remarkable thing about it is free. That's why I follow Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. You could say the same thing about how long something lasts. You're applying the resurrection, because everywhere they're going, they're preaching grace, which is forgiveness, and they're talking about the resurrection.
And your famous line is, he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. I'm looking at that. I said, that's an insurance policy there.
Yeah. And what I'm saying is you rent a car, they make you look at it. I mean, it's not like, because I had to do it, and you're looking at every little dent and speck and paint chip. Because if you bring it back and you read the consequences for any mistake, you're paying out the nose. And so you're inspecting this thing. Well, bring that, go do some bumping and grinding, getting on the interstate, swap some paint in a rental car, and then go back and turn it in. I'm going to tell you, the last thing you're going to get is grace.
Yeah.
You're like, well, okay, I had a little bump, No, you're fixed to pay 10 times the amount that you originally paid.
I got in the old white truck.
Hang on, Dad. Let's take a break. So I'm excited about a new sponsor for our podcast. They're called Faithful Counseling. And, I am a big believer in faith-based counseling. There's a lot of kind of wonky stuff out there, but these guys, I checked them out. They definitely come at things from a faith perspective. And, basically, Lisa and I, we had to have counseling. At one point in our life, I had a lot of people around me that helped me. All three of us have counseled people before and tried to help them just as lay counselors. But we needed somebody that really knew what they were doing and understood. And so basically that's what helped us to be able to work on our marriage. So if our listeners out there, you got issues, this is online counseling. Anything you share is confidential. They'll let you switch a counselor if for some reason you don't connect with them. There's text, there's chat, there's phone, there's video. So they can really help you. It's affordable, and sometimes you just need some help. And so I'm excited that these guys are our sponsors. So if you want to check them out, if you have some needs, go to faithfulcounseling.com/unashamed. That's faithfulcounseling.com/unashamed. You'll fill out a questionnaire. They'll assess your needs, and they'll match you with a counselor. So if you're in need, check these guys out.
I got into the old white truck yesterday. I said, uh-oh. Didn't hit a lick. Engine is turning over.
Well,
batteries.
I thought that was a turnover like it was running.
No, this was just nothing. The engine's turning over. The batteries are hot, but the vehicle will not crank.
Oh, it's not igniting.
Will not crank. And I shut the door. I said, Dan, get a wrecker down here. And I said, I think my fuel pump went out. I said, not getting fuel. I said, call, get the thing, drag it back up there to a place. So he calls a man. He made about 8 o'clock the next morning, looked up, there's a wrecker right there. They dragged the old white truck off. 6 years, never failed to crank. 6 years, not once did it ever fail to crank until yesterday. Wouldn't crank. He sent the message this morning. He said, tell Phil, the mechanic, tell Phil, fuel pump went out. I said, that's what I thought. He said, I'll have it to him in a couple of days. Rock on. So it wasn't pay out the nose. Just put a fuel pump on it, Jason, rock on. Well, that's kind of like...
But you own the truck. I'm saying if you rent a vehicle, they're going to try to come up. My whole point is the world takes advantage of any mistake in any way.
That is correct.
Like if you want to rent a car, they're like, here it is. If you change it whatsoever, you're going to pay 5 times what you originally paid.
That ain't just half of it. The rest of that story is some woman wrote me a thing and she said, I just got stripped of $200. They slicked me because they said you were the one selling the marijuana oil, and like an idiot, I bought some, shucked out $200. And I got no...
And now she wants $200 from you.
I got no kind of oil. And I said, well, there ought to be a law against that for people saying I'm selling marijuana oil. Here's a news flash.
I think there is a law.
Maybe. Here's a news flash to all you listeners. Don't buy marijuana oil and think I'm trying to sell you some. I don't have anything to do with marijuana, oil, or whatever. It's not me. They're lying to you. I don't sell marijuana oil.
Yeah.
But they keep saying they get slicked.
Dad, I had a guy come up to me in Michigan, and he was like, I got a question about your dad and this CBD oil. And before he could say anything, I said, hoax. And he went, what? I said,
It's a
hoax.
hoax.
He said, I guess you answered my question. It's a
Well,
hoax.
that's
That's
It's
the
an
whole
internet
theme
hoax.
of this. What we're talking about today is people will read the Bible and say, "Oh, the stories are too incredible." They'll go to the internet on a chat board and see an ad pop up and think that's 100% absolute truth. Put it in stone.
Yeah.
Oh, well, what's wrong with this?
That's right.
I
know,
will
it's
never
crazy. It
sell
doesn't make any sense.
marijuana oil or any other kind of oil, so don't buy it. They're lying to you.
Speaking of oil, I got 3 questions for you, Dad, about the truck. Just because I want our audience to understand this truck of yours. You've had it 6 years. How many times have you changed the oil? How many times have you cleaned it out? And how many times have you washed it in 6 years?
I would not answer those 3 questions because it may incriminate me. So I
Pleading the Fifth Amendment on car
pleading the fifth.
on car maintenance.
Yeah.
That's the last thing I thought you would say.
Yeah.
0.
I changed the
I mean,
oil.
I've just
I
watched
was
this
not
truck.
surprised
I can't even
when
get
it
in it.
didn't crank. I said, well, this thing has never failed me. I said, don't fail me now. But I checked it. I said, I don't think this thing getting any fuel. I called Red. He's a pseudo mechanic. Red, I tried to crank this thing. I said, it won't crank. It turns over fine, but it won't crank. He said, probably a fuel pump. He said, that's the way it works. You pull
I'd
out.
have said, does it have gas?
That guy told Dan this morning, he said, I've never seen a fuel pump that was that worn out. I can't believe that thing was still moving. But it's been good to me.
Well, I realized where I got my mechanical skills from, or lack thereof.
Exactly, which is why we need people in our lives, right?
Yeah.
So back to our text. When Paul basically either resurrects or comes back, he goes back to Antioch, which is where he's kind of been established there. And it was interesting, before we move into 15, that he did something I thought we should have mentioned on here, because he appointed elders, he and Barnabas did, in Antioch, which is kind of one of the first churches. Remember, it was up in the north, up in Syria.
Now, how would I remember that, Al? I don't. I mean, remember it's in the north. How would I know that?
Well, because Syria is north of Israel. I thought you knew that. Did you not? Were you not listening
I've
during
been
Old
there,
Testament geography?
But I was lost the entire time as far as direction. I mean, I wasn't sure where I was at. I knew one thing: stay inside the wall.
Well, I've never been there, but I have studied the geography of it.
Yeah.
But it was interesting that he kind of structured the church to have some leadership for when he left. And I think that's kind of what happens as he goes forward. I mean, he realizes that this is long term. So you're going to have some wisdom in these cities to be able to deal with all the stuff that happens. Because in the next chapter, in 15, we get back into the circumcision debate again. And we've already been talking about it all the way back to chapter 12.
But I'll tell you this, Al.
With Peter, when he preaches the first sermon.
He wrote a whole book to Galatia because of this issue that came up. But I think the reason you have elders, which is a good point, is because there's always an issue. Even in a modern day America, some group of people, they're always trying to add something to the simple message of Jesus as a prerequisite
That is correct.
to how we're going to function.
That is correct.
I mean, circumcision, people look at that and say, can you believe that? That people would say that you have to have Jesus and you have to have this procedure done on a male before you're in or you're out. And people, I can't believe that. And then you'll go right down the road and people say, now here's what we do here. And it's something to me just as ridiculous, whatever the rule is about or code of conduct or even dress code if it's not modesty related. But I mean, we always like these little inclusionary things to be branded as our group. And to me, you're adding to who Jesus is.
And hey, Jace, let's take a break.
The 2 girls that showed up Sunday morning, they said, we think we're in the wrong church. We're looking for the preacher here, but
you told us that story.
Well, I know. And I just said, well, he'll be around here directly. And so,
I still haven't figured out why you did that, but why didn't you just say, I'm the preacher?
Because I knew they were looking around and they figured that if you go within a group, you could see in their mind, the big dog, the preacher, that they were looking for him. I said, well,
I hate to be honest with you, Phil, but here's what I think. I think they thought, let's ask this homeless guy who the preacher is.
That's exactly what they did.
And you just didn't want to.
I played along with it. They said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Jim Smith." And they said, "Jim, it's good to meet you." I said, "Well, good to see you, girl."
No,
I said, "Well, you may be in the right church." But anyway, we converted both of them. So I thought, you know what? I like you couldn't tell is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I think
there's a lesson in that.
It's a noble quality, but I think it's more in this context. You should be going out, but they did say, okay, there's a central location, but when all the letters from Romans on, you see all the problems that occurred and came up. Because I have one thought about 1st and 2nd Corinthians that I've said many times when I've taught that book in classes. Where were the elders? Because that place, if you think your church has problems, that place was off the charts with problems. And I'm like, the elders are never mentioned. So maybe they were young in the faith.
Probably hadn't appointed him yet.
Maybe.
Yeah, probably hadn't appointed him yet at that point. He was still kind of trying to, give them letters and stuff.
People have made whole doctrines out of what they read in 1st and 2nd Corinthians.
Yep.
And I'm like, you got to realize the situation here, and look at the backdrop. They were young. We know they were a young church because everybody's a young church back here because Jesus just died and was buried and resurrected. They also had the power of all these miracles and all these crazy stories that we're reading. Well, these people were standing around there, and they wanted to have these fantastical acts, and God gave some of the people that the apostles laid their hands on the ability to do these powers. Well, they just couldn't handle it.
Yep.
And so all of a sudden, it got way away from sharing Jesus to your neighbor and having integrity in your life. And that's why he eventually gets to 15 in 1 Corinthians and reminds them of the gospel.
That, plus on top of that, they were trying to get human beings. I wonder if they run into that same problem 2,000 years later. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. Love does not boast. Love is not proud. Just think of the human race. Love is not rude. Love is not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. Love keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. Love always protects. Love always trusts. Love always hopes. Love always perseveres. The Apostle Paul and them are going across the country where there is no Jesus, and they're running into the human race, and they're thinking, man, that's why 2,000 years later, when we say we're trying to get them to love God and love each other, it's a chore, Al.
It is. And something I found fascinating, Jase brought this up about circumcision. Paul, who has been circumcised because he was a Jew, he's not against circumcision. The context is that you have to be circumcised to be a Christian, which is the false part of that. What's interesting is we know, and that's why it's very important when you're studying the Bible, that you understand the context of everything you're reading.
Plus,
why was it written?
Plus, circumcision is not going to help you when it comes to being patient and rejoices with the truth. Love always.
And half the population can't even do it.
I know it.
Right. So here's something for you to chew on. You may not have thought about. When we get to Acts 16, I'll jump ahead just a bit. When Timothy pops up, and Timothy had a Greek father and a Jewish mother and grandmother. Now we know that Timothy is one of Paul's early proteges. You got 1st and 2nd Timothy. He was one of the early church leaders. But in verse 3 of 16, I find this fascinating to show you that contextually, maybe sometimes it's not a bad thing. Verse 3, Paul wanted to take him along on the journey. He's just met this family. So he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek.
Yep.
So I find that fascinating that Paul, who basically is the biggest proponent of you don't have to have circumcision of the gospel, he circumcises Timothy because he feels like it'll help their ministry. So, it shows you that he's not just down on one thing. It's easy for us to just throw everything out. What he said was, in this case, I want Timothy, because they knew he had a Greek father, to be able to speak to a Jewish audience. So I found that fascinating about the context that Paul was saying in one chapter, look, don't trust in this, but the other chapter, he actually practices it, to help Timothy be more.
Exactly. Faithful. But my point is, it's like, you pick anything, tattoos. I've seen spiritual, seemingly Jesus-loving people say, well, you can't have a tattoo. I'm like, what? I mean, you know what I mean? It's like you're really going down this road. It's Jesus and the lack of a tattoo, because his point in this whole sermon when he says, I like this phrase he uses in 15:8 when he said, God who knows the heart showed that he accepted them by giving them the Holy Spirit to them, just as he did to us, because they were struggling with the Jew versus Gentile situation. They had the Holy Spirit, but then they're like, oh yeah, but there's something physical that's not right, which is why, tattoos popped into my head, which is a long way from circumcision. I guess I thought pain is involved in receiving both, possibly.
Yep.
But he goes down in verse 11 and he says, we believe it is through the grace of our Lord Jesus that we are saved, just as they are. I mean, to me, that's the bumper sticker moment of their movement, which is this being in Jesus, which is very hard for people to get what I'm fixing to say in their heads, but I'm using it on that statement, is 100% grace-based.
Yep.
And it was his story, not mine. Jesus is the innocent sacrifice. We don't deserve it. There's nothing you can do to earn it. There's no good thing you can add or lack thereof that's going to save you outside of the grace of Jesus. But people just, I don't know, Al. They have a hard time digesting that, because you have the stories, you have the examples, you have a whole letter written to a whole group of people saying, don't add anything to Jesus and the gospel. In fact, he says, if you do, you'll be eternally cut off. That's Galatians 1:6.
Condemned.
It can't be any
anathema.
It cannot be any more. He cannot say it any more clear. And look, then he says, and so I say again. He repeats himself in Galatians 1:6.
Jace, let's take one last break. And to your point, in chapter 15, verse 19, James, the brother of Jesus, is basically one of the elders at the church at Jerusalem, but he's also the guy everybody looks to. I mean, he's solid, he's stable. Obviously, he's Jesus' brother. He wrote the book of James, which is a great book. He said something really interesting in verse 19. He says, it is my judgment, this is him as an elder, as an early church leader, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. So what he's saying is, we don't want to make this hard. I mean, we want to make this easy. Like you said, Dad, love each other. I mean, that's right. We want to make this easy. But then he says, instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, meat strangling. He mentions all the different Gentile lifestyle issues that they were having coming out of that pagan world. So I did find it interesting that that's the way we should approach each other. It should be, we want to make it easy for people to find Jesus. And then we want to tell them, look, this lifestyle, this stuff you got going on, this is not good. It's not healthy. It's not what Jesus wants for your life. Yeah. So they had some things to teach them, but they had to get out of their Jewishness to do it.
And I think too, looking at it from the other side in these stories, we haven't mentioned this yet, but when this missionary journey started, Mark, who has a book in the Bible, he didn't stay with them. He's like, and right. When you do a study on Mark, you'll conclude that in the end, they all patch things up. And maybe he was a little young and immature at the time.
Yep.
I mean, I'm reading between the lines there. But for whatever reason, well, here in Acts 15, which they're on the same team, Paul and Barnabas have such a sharp disagreement, which says it at the end of chapter 15 that they part company. And you That's see right. the introduction of elders here. And my point is, we're going to get this wrong. And so you would think people would not miss the grace of God, but guess what? It's going to happen. And some people, maybe because they're young in the faith, but sometimes you just can't agree on, maybe things about where we're going to go share Jesus or build this water well for, in Africa to help kids or whatever the issue is. You have disagreements, you get things wrong, but what I like about what God did through these people is you see that they didn't burn the bridge with each other. They found ways to reconnect and do other things and have roles and put sharing Jesus as the overall mission. No matter what happens, even if it's bumpy for a few days, weeks, or months, we're going to come back together for the cause.
I hope the religious people across the United States and the world through this, we're just speaking to these matters, will at least agree to all come together on Jesus, him crucified, raised from the dead. I'll just stand on that.
I'm glad you brought up Mark, John Mark, as he's called in the text there, Jase, because there's a couple of interesting things about him. One is he was a cousin of Barnabas. So it's not really surprising that then when Paul gets into it about Mark, Barnabas, who's his cousin, takes up for him. And I thought about that line in Open Range at the end of it after Robert Duvall killed the bad guy. He said, if somebody needs to write a letter to his daughter and tell him what happened here, and they said, well, I don't think they have a relationship. He said, yeah, but people are funny. Ken are funny when stuff like this happens. Yeah. And I thought about that with this situation because, they're kin. And so they split up. But you're right, Jase. And the other thing about John Mark, he was also Peter's protege. Basically, his writing of the gospel was sort of Peter's account because he was his right-hand man. But, it's interesting that Paul and Peter would struggle throughout their early years together because, Paul felt like Peter was showing favoritism and he wasn't really being fair to Gentiles, even though he was the one that ushered them in.
We're still, I think we're still only human, Al.
But you got to remember, too,
That's
Al,
right.
like I'm married. I mean, you asked me about Missy earlier, and look, we have, I've said this many times, it's true. I mean, all we have in common is Jesus. That's enough. But when we first got married, she was not raised in a family where you disagree and argue. You don't welcome these confrontations. I like disagreeing and I like arguing. And I like doing it with people I love and I know are strong enough to where their opinion matters to me. I mean, people I don't care about, I'm not going to argue with them because I don't care. So, I mean, that was before I matured in that area. I mean, when I'm sharing Jesus with people, I'm trying not to argue or disagree. But my point is, well, I kept telling Missy that. Well, through the years, she's like, okay. So now we have public arguments, and people get a kick out of watching us because we
saw it on the podcast.
I do it all the time. But what I'm telling you is I learn a lot in those conversations. I mean, I don't know if I shared this, when she was writing her blog for Passover week, we got into an argument about something that really wasn't that big a deal. And we literally talked, discussed, and argued all night. But it was all good, and it was all Jesus related. And it was done in love, but it was passionate. But I learned more from that argument than I could learn it going to some class because she was giving me a different opinion and that I had really never thought about and I didn't agree with. And I'm not sure we really ever came to a complete agreement, but I noticed when she wrote her blog, she leaned toward my position. Not that I think she just didn't bring hers up because I think she thought that it would be too many people would think like I do. And it really what people are probably going to say, well, what was it about? What was it about? But it was basically about who was in the crowd hollering for Barnabas to be released remember when Pilate said, which one of you? And she was like, it was all a trap. And I agreed. It was all a trap and it all was a coup. But I was making the point because of Peter's denial that any Jews around would have found it very difficult to take up for Jesus in that moment. Once he's basically not handcuffed, but bound and fixed to die. Because I said, look, everybody likes a hero and everybody likes a movement until somebody's arrested. And then all of a sudden we're like, well, wait a minute here. Because there's fear. So anyway, that was the gist of the argument. But I'm just making the point that I think it's healthy that if you keep the big picture at the forefront, it's not something we should shy away from, being passionate about what we believe and what we teach and having these arguments. But you don't burn the bridges.
Love is patient.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And unfortunately, we've seen enough this last year. We've seen enough, to your point, we've seen enough mobs to know you're exactly right. In the moment of the mob, man, it's hard to swim upstream and do the right thing.
And if your disagreement reaches a certain level, well, that's when you need to go talk to the elders.
Yeah.
Which is always humbling. Hey, I've been in on a few of those,
Well, and full disclosure, Dad and I are elders at our church. And basically, it's a servant position because we're just trying to help people. But it is important to have leadership. So next time we come back, we pick up in the story, we'll actually be shifting over to what they call the second missionary journey. And it begins with Timothy sort of being added to the team. And so we'll go from there. A lot of good stuff.
Thanks for listening to the Unashamed podcast. Help us out by rating us on iTunes. And don't miss an episode by subscribing on YouTube. And be sure to click that little bell to get notified about new episodes. And for even more content that you won't get anywhere else, subscribe to Blaze TV at blazetv.com/unashamed.